We've known for over a year now that big tech has been actively censoring Americans who spoke out against orthodoxy when it came to COVID-19 and vaccines. But today we're getting new information showing that the Centers for Disease Control actually worked hand in hand with big tech companies to squash dissent on their platforms. Litigation counsel for the new Civil Liberties Alliance, Jenin Younes, has been on the front line exposing the lies of pandemic orthodoxy, and she joins me now. Jenin, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is interesting because people will have been thinking this was going on for some time. Here's the Washington Free Beacon reporting on it. Over the course of at least 6 months, starting in December 2020, CDC officials regularly communicated with personnel at Twitter, Facebook, and Google over vaccine misinformation. At various times, CDC officials would flag specific posts by users on social media platforms such as Twitter as example posts to censor. Is this, I mean, you know, we often talk about the First Amendment, Jenin, and people will say, well, if it's not the government, they can do whatever they want. Is the government allowed to tell companies, you got to shut those guys down?
No, the government isn't, and that's sort of the big struggle that's going on here. So I actually had a case, and there were a couple of other people had cases, Justin Hart and the Children's Health Defense, that were dismissed because the judge said that you can't show that the government is driving this censorship. For all you know, these companies might have done it on their own. And sure, the government has made these statements because beginning in about April or May of 2021, various officials within the Biden administration were saying things like, if big tech doesn't do more to censor COVID misinformation, then we might impose regulatory or other legal consequences. So it was our contention that those threats were enough to show that the government was coercing the tech companies, and that's a First Amendment violation. But these emails, and there was also a revelation in June where it became clear that there's this disinformation governance board within DHS that was similar. It's orchestrating, it's using these tech companies to direct censorship of Americans, and that is unlawful, and courts should start finding it unlawful.
I mean, you had a quote from an article in the Tablet where you wrote that the natural tendency of censorship is to lock in an ever narrower and more counterproductive echo chamber. It has been shocking to a lot of people, I think, to see just how rigid and unconcerned with correcting things they've been all along here, especially when it comes to COVID orthodoxy and what's allowed, what's not allowed. I mean, still to this day, social media platforms they put this COVID warning on the bottom of anything that is not sort of COVID approved. And now it seems that there was at least implicit, if not explicit, government demands for this behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what these emails show even more. Another thing that was in the emails that I found rather shocking is that the CDC accepted a $15 million quote-unquote gift of ad space from Facebook so that the government could run its messages on Facebook. Well, at the same time, the CDC is the branch of the government that's doing this. They're also suppressing the views of Americans that they don't agree with through using tech companies. So they're really tilting the scale in their own favor, where only the government's message is heard, or the government's message is heard much more. And as you know, another component of this that I think is really important is that the government has gotten so many things wrong, and things that were misinformation yesterday, like masks don't really do very much to stem the spread of COVID, the vaccines don't seem to be very good at stopping transmission. Well, now we know they're true. And that sort of exemplifies why we have a First Amendment. The framers of the Constitution recognized that it's important to have dissent, that sometimes the majority voice is wrong, and that often government is wrong.
What kind of damages or what kind of redress is there? I mean, let's say that these emails, for example, prove that there really was, and I mean, I certainly believe there was, I think we know there was, but let's say you can prove in court that there was a concerted government effort to collude with the social media platforms to silence certain perspectives on COVID. If that really is provable, what can happen? I mean, can people get monetary compensation? I mean, what goes on in the legal sense?
I think it may be hard to get monetary compensation, but what we're hoping for is that in our case, which we're appealing, and various other cases, we're hoping that the courts say this is illegal, the government cannot do that. That's called declaratory and injunctive relief, and basically just says the government cannot engage in this sort of behavior anymore.
Yeah. I mean, well, that would be good. It would be good if we could actually get the government to respect the First Amendment to the Constitution. By the way, there's other areas where concerns about censorship and the application of it via the federal government are coming up. For example, Vice President Kamala Harris put out a statement on the White House task force to address online harassment and abuse. This is the statement. This task force will tackle a threat that has been far too real for far too many people for far too long. Oh, God. The collective work will help modernize the federal government's response to violence against women and people of all genders. It will lead to more evidence-informed policies and interventions, and it will support more federal funding to address online harassment and abuse. How is the federal government going to be policing online harassment? I'm very curious to see what this is supposed to look like.
Yeah, well, I would like to know that too. Actually, that was what the tablet article I wrote that you cited earlier was actually about. I mean, these are very poorly thought out initiatives. I think they're sort of feel good. They sound good, you know. Oh, who wouldn't want to, you know, fight online harassment and abuse? But when you really think about it, what it means is the government is, again, inserting itself in whose voices are heard and whose are silenced. What is abuse? What is harassment? Is disagreeing with somebody harassment? People are constantly reporting each other on Twitter because they're, you know, offended because someone called them a name. And this is really not, the government should really not be involved in this. And I think one of the reasons that courts are so reluctant to do anything is because it's really new territory. We just haven't seen anything like this before because of the nature of social media. But I do think that, you know, if 50 years ago, the government had been telling the New York Times, you really shouldn't be writing pieces about, you know, X, Y, and Z, or this perspective on X, Y, and Z, the courts would have recognized that that was a First Amendment violation, and they should do that here, because that's what's going on. The government is deciding ultimately who gets to be heard and who is silenced.
Just going back for a second to the COVID censorship issue, I don't know if you saw this, Jenin, but the World Health Organization became so desperate to censor Americans about the pandemic that they were recruiting infodemic managers who were everyday Americans reporting misinformation online. This flyer for recruitment for this program states, wanted infodemic manager unicorn, recruiting the first global cohort of infodemic managers to support health authorities in addressing COVID-19 misinformation. Scan and apply. I can't even believe. Guys, are we sure that's even real? I guess it does have the seal.
It's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. And I think it's also really important. So I think, you know, what's going to happen is some people will argue, and even some libertarians argue, that what's happening here is that the companies and the government have the same aim. You know, the companies are mostly left-wing, and they want to be suppressing this information as well. So they're working together, and therefore that's okay. But you know, we need to recognize that there's an inherent power imbalance here. The government has been overtly threatening the tech companies, and it's during this time that the tech companies are giving the government $15 million gifts and then doing their bidding. That this is not a partnership that, you know, should be allowed. The government should not be in this business, and the courts have to recognize that.
Jenin, appreciate the expertise. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.